Welcome everybody to this CPC seminar. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Peter Eibich to you. Peter is currently Deputy Head of the Research Group Labour Demography at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, as you can see from his slide. So Peter was trained in economics, has a PhD in economics, and then following finishing his degree, his PhD at the University of Hamburg, you then went to Oxford, didn't you, and worked at Nuffield College in the Health Economics Research Centre. So you do have experience of working quite close to us in Southampton, there in Oxford. And then after that, you went to Rostock to work at Max Planck. I think Peter's research is really interesting because it spans a number of areas, both demographic, a bit gerontology, certainly economics, econometrics, and health economics. And on your CV, I think you classify yourself as having two main areas of research, which is health economics and applied econometrics. Although I would suggest to you that demography is increasingly creeping in there, and you have some really interesting publications relating in part to the project which you lead at Max Planck in relation to the reciprocal relationships between retirement and health. There you see all the bits coming together: demography, economics, and gerontology. And today you're going to be talking about retirement, but its relationship with voluntary work. So we're very interested to hear what you've got to say, and we'll take questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this very nice introduction. So as you just said, one of my major interests really is in what I call the economics of aging and retirement. But of course, I like to think of myself as a fairly interdisciplinary researcher, and for me, it's always more about how interesting I find a research question rather than where the disciplinary boundaries lie. So really, it's about aging and retirement, and I've investigated a number of questions in this, looking particularly how retirement affects the behavior of older people. And this paper that I would like to present today is very firmly in line with this. So the paper is titled, "Does Retirement Affect Voluntary Work Provision? Evidence from England, Ireland, and the US." And this is joint work with a colleague at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, Angelo Ruenti, and Irene Mosca, who is an economist from Maynooth University in Ireland. We have a working paper version of this paper out there from last year. If you look at this, you might see perhaps one or two minor changes as to what I'm going to present to you today, but I think at the core this is still the same. So if you find my presentation interesting enough that you would like to read more about this, then please, by all means, have a look at our working paper. So to start with, I want to briefly motivate why we should care and why we should think about voluntary work. So just for the UK, we have in the paper also numbers for Ireland and the US, but in the UK, the Office for National Statistics has, in a relatively recent report, shown that volunteers in the UK worked 1.9 billion hours in 2015, and that work that they provided, largely unpaid for, of course, was valued at 22 billion pounds. So just putting on my economist hat, that is a fairly substantial amount of work and a large value that's created for the economy there. But even beyond that, voluntary work is quite important because voluntary work has important benefits both to society and the volunteer. We know that there are many non-profit organizations that really rely on volunteer labor for their functioning, and that is certainly true from my own experience living in the UK, where you have major charities like thematically fitting Age UK, for example, that do provide value to society. And volunteer labor is really important for these non-profit organizations. There's also research that suggests that indeed voluntary work can help to build and maintain social cohesion in a society. And I think the importance of that we've seen certainly throughout the last decade, as that has become less of a given in some societies. And from the aging or the gerontological perspective, volunteering can be considered as part of active aging, meaning that older people do not completely withdraw from society and from active life, but remain active in old age. And that, of course, has important benefits for the volunteer by helping to preserve health and well-being at older ages. So voluntary work is really important. And likewise, older people are important for the provision of voluntary work. So here we contrast on that slide the rates of participation in voluntary work in the 3 countries that we're going to look at in our analysis: the UK, Ireland, and the US. And you see that in the UK, about 41% reported to volunteer any amount of time in 2015. In Ireland, it's a bit less, it's 28%, and it's about 25% in the US. And if we compare that to the rate of participation in voluntary work in the population of the over 65s, we see these numbers are actually quite similar. So in the UK, we have 37% of the over 65s provided voluntary work. In Ireland, it's exactly the same at 28% as in the general population. And in the US, it's just slightly less at 24%. It shouldn't be a surprise that it is slightly less because, of course, at older age, at some point, the capabilities of people start to decrease as sort of like older people have to deal more and more with health limitations. And so to that extent, it should not be very surprising that perhaps older people are volunteering slightly less than the general population. But the really important point is that the rates, despite these health limitations, are very close. And older people really constitute an important part of the volunteer workforce in all 3 of these countries. Now, we're not the first paper to think about the relationship between paid work and unpaid voluntary work. There have been a couple of papers, and I will show some of these in a second. There have been a couple of papers primarily in the sociological and the gerontological literature that have thought about this relationship and that have come up with a framework on how employment and voluntary work might be related to each other. And there are 2 hypotheses which for our research question here can be considered as competing hypotheses. There's first the hypothesis of activity substitution, meaning that paid work and unpaid voluntary work can be considered substitutes, so that if people decrease the amount of paid work that they do, that we might expect to see an increase in the amount of unpaid work that they do, or vice versa. And there's a number of different theoretical explanations that might motivate such a pattern. One, from an economics perspective, would be the opportunity costs of time. That as the exit out of the paid or out of paid employment, the transition into retirement frees up leisure time for individuals. That reduces their costs of engaging in unpaid voluntary work. Because of course now they don't earn their income by working more hours anymore, but they earn their income through a pension, and that enables them to invest their time into other behaviors. And in some of my other papers, I've shown that this mechanism is relevant in, for example, explaining some of the health effects of retirement that have been reported in the literature. An alternative explanation would be role continuity, that as people withdraw from paid employment and transition into retirement, that they try to maintain some of their previously held roles as for example, a productive part of society, or of their role of as being someone in a certain employment position, and that they're looking for some continuity, and they find this, or they are able to uphold that continuity by engaging in voluntary work. And then there's, of course, this active aging hypothesis that I already mentioned, where volunteers might, or where retirees might aim to engage in voluntary work in order to preserve their health and well-being. That's all different theoretical explanations for why we might expect to see activity substitution. The alternative hypothesis would be that we see activity complementarity. And the literature on complementarity between paid work and voluntary work essentially recognizes that there are complex motivations for why individuals engage in voluntary work, but part of this motivation might actually be career advancement, that people volunteer because it helps them build up relevant skills that are important for their career, because it helps them to expand their networks, because perhaps it is expected to someone in a certain position to give back to society by engaging in voluntary work. So from this perspective, then of course all of these motivations become no longer relevant once people withdraw from paid employment. So volunteering for the sake of career advancement might imply that people reduce their voluntary work provision once they retire. And of course, I've already mentioned that in old age, very generally, but to some extent perhaps also in retirement, people have to adapt to reduced capacities and capabilities in terms of health, in terms of cognitive functioning. There's some research that suggests that retirement might reduce cognitive functioning in older individuals, and that might suggest that older individuals have less opportunities or less capacity to engage in voluntary work, and we therefore might expect to see complementarity between paid employment and voluntary work. As you can see, these all seem like very reasonable theoretical propositions, and to some extent, I think we can come up with anecdotal evidence for each of these. So ultimately, really, it is an empirical question on which of these motives dominates, and that's why in this paper we're trying to address this and provide empirical evidence on this question. Just a very brief note on some of the existing literature. So the relationship between paid work and voluntary work has received quite a bit of attention in the literature, but we have to say that a lot of this evidence comes from cross-sectional study and is essentially correlational. There are really only a handful of studies that made use of longitudinal data, which might allow us to start thinking about the causality, whether it really is that retirement has a causal effect on voluntary work, or whether it is indeed the other way around, that people retire early in order to be able to engage in more voluntary work. So there are a couple of studies that have looked at selected countries like the US, Germany, and there's this Di Gessa and Grundy study that looked at 4 different countries. Broadly, the evidence from these studies does seem to suggest activity substitution, but they all highlight changes at what in economics we would call the internal margin, meaning that really continuity is more important than people newly picking up voluntary work. So so what this means is that they highlight that that people tend to stick with voluntary work over the retirement transition, and perhaps they might increase the amount that they volunteer, but it's much less the case that people who have not volunteered while in paid employment suddenly start volunteering in retirement. So the key thing is that there really is only one earlier study that addresses the fact that indeed retirement is what in economics we'd call an endogenous variable, meaning that it is a choice variable, and therefore in a simple, even with longitudinal data, we can't just ascribe a causal interpretation to essentially a regression of voluntary work on retirement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on, but at the moment, I just want to note there's one study by a French researcher, Anne Laferrière, who looked at continental Europe using the share data in a very similar methodological framework as what we're going to use here. And she reported that retirement does indeed seem to have a causal effect on the amount of voluntary work provided, in that retirees provide more voluntary work. So let me give you a very brief overview of the data that we're using to try and address our question whether retirement affects voluntary work provision. We make use of data from 3 studies here. These come from the family of longitudinal aging studies, which are designed to very closely mirror each other to facilitate analysis across different countries, essentially in a very similar way as to what we're going to do here in this paper. So we use data from the ELSA study, that's the English longitudinal study on aging, from the TILDA study, that's the Irish longitudinal study on aging, and the health and retirement study in the US. We broadly cover the period 2009 to 2016 here in this paper in all 3 of these data sets. The reason for this period is that I think the first wave of the TILDA data was collected in 2009, and that's why we start in 2009. And when we did the analysis on this paper, we only had data available until 2016. Just earlier today, I had a meeting with Irene and Angelo to discuss a couple of changes that we're going to make to that paper. And one of the things that we still have to decide on is whether now we can update that to look at more recent years until 2018, 2019. But for the time being, we look at essentially the period 2009 to 2016. We look at individuals aged 50 to 69 here, and that is, of course, to include individuals that are relatively close to the retirement thresholds in these different countries. And we limit ourselves to consider people that reported having ever done any paid work. So we exclude those that report that they were never engaged in any paid work. We look at 3 outcomes throughout the paper, and these outcomes are slightly differently defined in these different studies, unfortunately. So briefly, we look at people reporting any amount of volunteering in the last year, or people reporting more frequent volunteering. And in ELSA and TILDA, this means we look at people that report volunteering at least once a month or at least once a week. Whereas in the HRS, that question is asked in a slightly different way. And here we're looking at people who report doing at least 100 hours of voluntary work per year, or at least 200 hours of voluntary work per year. And we argue that this should correspond perhaps to some level to at least monthly and at least weekly frequencies. But of course, we have to acknowledge that these are not very directly comparable, which is also why we don't pool data from these data sets, but really sort of like analyze each data set separately. Our treatment that we're interested in here is, of course, retirement. And in our main analysis, we also include those reporting to be semi-retired or homemakers as retired. But of course, we conduct a couple of sensitivity analysis on this later on. And throughout most of the models, we do control for an age trend. We do control for education using the ISCET classification. We do control for ethnicity in England and the US. We don't control for ethnicity in the TILDA data because there is pretty much, well, let's say there's very little variation in ethnicity in the TILDA data. And then we do control for marital status, meaning we're looking at, we're controlling for whether people have a partner or not. So we start our analysis by looking at simple regression models and fixed effects regression models, but this is primarily really to gain a first impression of what this looks like in the data and perhaps how our results measure up to what's been done before. The problem is that there are endogeneity concerns in the sense that, as I said, that retirement is a choice no one is forced to retire at a certain age. And that means, of course, that this choice can be affected by a number of really other variables that might be related to the provision of voluntary work. I think two very obvious candidates here are health. Health is always going to be a problem when we're looking at retirement, because health is one of the major determinants of retirement, and in particular of early retirement, of course. And of course, as I mentioned, health might be related to the people's capacity to provide voluntary work, but there might also be personality traits that might determine to which extent someone engages in voluntary work, and how close their attachment to the labor market is. Last but not least, there might be reverse causality, which is essentially means that, as I mentioned earlier, that it could certainly be the case that some people choose to take early retirement because they want to focus on more meaningful activities. In particular for I think self-employed individuals, or those that come from a socioeconomically advantaged background, this is always a choice that they can make. And therefore, if we sort of like look at longitudinal data here, it can be very difficult to disentangle which way the causality runs when we're just estimating, for example, like a fixed effects regression model. So what we're going to do to address this then is to use state pension ages as instrumental variables. So just very briefly, so in England, in the period that we were looking at here, men could draw on their state pension from age 65 onwards. For women, this was initially at age 60, but then through a couple of successive reforms was increased to 63 in our data. In England, in Ireland, for both men and women, the state pension age used to be 65, but then was increased to 66 in 2014. And in the US, we look at two age thresholds here. One is the age threshold for eligibility for Social Security benefits at age 62, and then the normal retirement age at age 65, which was increased over the period that we're considering here to age 66. And of course, these reforms are fully accounted for in our data. But what this essentially means is, intuitively, we're making use of the fact that these state pension ages provide a financial incentive for people to retire when they are eligible for this state pension. So when they have reached that age threshold, because people younger than these ages cannot draw on the state pension yet, so they have to support themselves through other means. That could be savings, but those could also be private pensions. And I think in all three countries, these do play quite an important role in retirement. But once they reach that state pension age, they become eligible for the state pension, and they're able to draw on this financial support, and that essentially creates a financial incentive to delay retirement until that age. And this financial incentive, importantly, is independent of changes in, for example, health. It is completely independent of personality traits. So this really allows us to identify random variation in retirement that we can use to identify a causal effect here. And we do this by estimating a two-stage least squares model, or that can be expressed in these equations that you see here. So we essentially regress retirement status on our so-called instrument. So this is an indicator of whether the individual I in year T is above the state pension age or not. And then we have a quadratic age trend. We have dummy variables for the survey wave. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have a couple of control variables that we include, which are not shown in this equation here. And then we estimate the second stage equation where we regress our outcome. So these would be these different frequencies of voluntary work provision on predicted retirement status and the age trend. So we're essentially using only the variation in retirement that can be predicted based on age and eligibility for the state pension here to estimate the effect of retirement on voluntary work provision. So just to give you a brief impression of our data, so here you see the different frequencies for voluntary work. You see for ELSA, participation in voluntary work seems to line up relatively well with what I mentioned earlier based on the ONS figures. And quite a lot of these people do actually volunteer quite frequently. You see voluntary work provision in TILDA is larger than what was reported before. And the reason for this is that throughout this paper, we aim to look at formal volunteering. So that is people providing work for an organization. But the way the question in TILDA was asked is that that this was not clear that this was restricted to formal volunteering. So this might also include so-called informal volunteering. So that's people helping friends and relatives outside of the context of an organization. And therefore you see here that the rates that we see may be higher than what we see in the official statistics. But that is not going to be a major concern for our empirical strategy. In this figure, you see how labor force participation develops, and this is for men. I'll show you the figure for women in a second. So we see that as people age, the share of individuals working here, so that is the bottom category, consistently declines. We see that it does decline more steeply at certain ages. So for example, here you see a relatively steep drop off at age 65 for men. Likewise here in TILDA. And for the HRS, this is a bit more gradual. And then most of these people sort of like seem to substitute going from working to retirement status. There are a couple of people here that are unemployed and that start reporting themselves as retired. And then we have people that are permanently sick or disabled. And for men, we have a very tiny proportion of people that report themselves to be homemakers. For women, this looks somewhat similar. We have again relatively steep drop-offs round about where these retirement ages are. The main difference, I guess, here is that we have a more substantial proportion of people that report themselves to be homemakers. I think somewhat reassuringly, this proportion is relatively stable over age, so we don't have to worry too much about people reporting themselves to be a homemaker before they reach the state pension age, and then changing their answer to retired once they reach that state pension age. That does seem to happen for people that are permanently sick or disabled or unemployed, but not so much for homemakers. So when we look at our volunteering outcomes, we see that overall the rate of volunteering does seem to perhaps increase a little bit with age in ELSA. It seems to be roughly constant in TILDA and the HRS. But importantly, it looks a little bit, if we look at the state pension ages here at 65, you see there seems to be a bit of a jump, maybe perhaps about 5 percentage points in ELSA. It's a bit less clear here in TILDA whether there's anything here, but it's like we see a relatively clear jump here again in the HRS, and of course, because our assumption is essentially that the only thing that is changing for these people, conditional on age, at these specific age thresholds, is that they now have the possibility to retire. Intuitively, that means that these changes that we observe here can be attributed as a causal effect of retirement. So this is for any volunteering. If we look at monthly volunteering, we see this actually does seem to increase with age in all countries, and you see a substantially clearer jump here at these state pension ages for men, and this is weekly volunteering. Again, here now, and even in TILDA, we see a very clear and very strong increase in the proportion of men that say that they're providing weekly voluntary work at the state pension age here at about 65. So for women, the pattern, I'm not going to go through all of these one by one for women, partially because I think the pattern is just a lot less clear. If we sort of like look at this, we see that yes, there seem to be perhaps a couple of comparable jumps, but they're always less pronounced than those that we do observe for men. And overall, the pattern of voluntary work provision for women seems to be somewhat more smooth. Let's put it like this. So in this figure now, you see sort of like the main results from our regression models. And as I mentioned, we also look at ordinary least squares and fixed effects regression models just for comparison purposes. So the ordinary least squares model here are shown in black. In the fixed effects models, you see here in red. And then our instrumental variables models are those in green. The markers are point estimates, and the bars are the confidence intervals here. And if we look at men, we see that certainly in England, in all models, we find a significant positive impact of retirement on voluntary work, somewhat constant across these frequencies of voluntary work in the OLS and fixed effects model. But once we address the endogeneity of the retirement decision, we kind of see that this effect that we estimate, in particular for weekly voluntary work provision, is much larger. And what this suggests essentially is that that in these ordinary least squares and fixed effects regression models, there is a downward bias which pulls our estimate of the effect of retirement on voluntary work provision towards zero. And that makes a lot of sense because, of course, poor health as a predictor of retirement status would imply such a downward bias, in the sense that people that retire because of poor health are also less likely to provide voluntary work. We see a similar, perhaps even more pronounced pattern in Ireland and the US here, in the sense that now the estimates from the OLS and fixed effects models are not even significant or much smaller than they are in England. But once we address this endogeneity problem in the retirement variable, we see that less so for any voluntary work provision, but certainly for sort of like medium and high frequency voluntary work provision, we see a large and significant impact of retirement on voluntary work provision. And just a brief note on the point estimates here. So this is an increase of about 10 percentage points, a little bit larger in the US. So between 10 and 20 percentage points, and that's relatively similar in magnitude to the estimates that Anne Laferrière reported in her paper on continental Europe with the share data. So the results for women are somewhat similar here, that we find a large and significant impact of retirement and voluntary work in England. Less so in Ireland. There we only find something significant for monthly voluntary work provision, but also certainly for the US. So then in the paper, and I'll try and be very brief about this, but then in the paper we'll scrutinize our instrumental variables model a little bit, just to really make sure that the assumptions that we have to make here are fulfilled. And essentially what you see here in this table is that indeed being aged over the age threshold for the state pension age is a strong and significant predictor of retirement. Of about 32% of men retire at the state pension age in England. In Ireland, it's even stronger, and then in the US, these effects are a little bit weaker, but still quite strong. The same holds true for women. Another important assumption is, of course, that the only thing really that should change at the state pension age is that people are now eligible for retirement, and what we therefore do is we look at a couple of covariates that we think should not be affected by reaching that certain age threshold. So, for example, we're looking at whether people are in a partnership, and you can see that indeed this is relatively smooth around sort of like these thresholds that we're looking at here. So this is also building our confidence that this works well. I think, and this part really is quite important, that now there have been recent developments in the econometric literature that allow us to test the joint validity and monotonicity conditions necessary for our instrumental variable models. And we apply this test here to see whether we can reject the null hypothesis that our instruments are valid predictors or are valid as instruments for retirement status. And essentially what you see here in the table, that for men, for England, Ireland, and for normal retirement in the US, we fail to reject that null hypothesis. But importantly, for early retirement in the US and for women in England, we reject that null hypothesis. So what this means is that for women in England and for early retirement in the US, there are reasons to think that indeed these age thresholds might not be valid instruments for retirement status, and therefore these estimates that I showed you for these groups should perhaps be taken with a grain of salt. And I think that is particular concern for the ELSA estimates for women, because as you can see here, as I mentioned in the figure, there doesn't seem to be the age profile of volunteering seems to be rather smooth. So to some extent, it's a surprise that we do find these significant effects. And this might, of course, be related to this finding here that indeed perhaps the age threshold is not a valid predictor, a valid instrument for retirement status for women. And one of the possible reasons, so of course the test does not tell us why this is the case, but one of the possible reasons could be that indeed there are other things that change in the UK at the retirement age for women. I think one example would be the free bus passes. Now, of course, you could ask yourself, to which extent is it plausible that the provision of free bus passes to elderly people is related to their voluntary work provision? But I think it's at least not out of the. It is imaginable that this might be one of the reasons for why we reject the validity of the instrument here. We do we look at a couple of dimensions of possible heterogeneity in these effects here, and I only want to show you one in particular, and that is previous engagement in voluntary work, because as I mentioned, the existing literature has put a lot of emphasis on continuity of voluntary work provision over the retirement transition. And so we are asking ourselves whether this increase in voluntary work provision is an adjustment at the internal margin or at the external margin, meaning is it that people that already provided voluntary work are now providing more voluntary work, or is it that people that did not volunteer before now started volunteering? And so here in this panel, you see the estimates for men that did not volunteer in the previous wave. And you can see here the estimated effects of retirement are almost always insignificant, except for very high frequency volunteering in the US. They're also certainly in the case of England and to some extent Ireland, they're much smaller than what we saw in the figures. So this does not seem to be so much driven by people picking up volunteering after they had retired, but more that people indeed increased the amount of voluntary work that they did provide. We see sort of like large and significant increases among men that did volunteer in the previous wave. Because of sample size considerations, these are not quite as precisely estimated as before, but nevertheless, I think the pattern here is very clear, and that shows in line with earlier studies that this seems to be an adjustment at the internal margin. For women, the pattern is a little bit more difficult in the sense that we find the same thing for women in England. But as I said, these results should be taken with a grain of salt, as our instrumental variable strategy might not provide valid causal estimates here. And for the HRS, this indeed seems to be driven by women that pick up voluntary work. We also look at effects, different heterogeneity by education and by partnership status, and we find some differences across countries there. I think broadly we find that the effects of retirement on volunteering seem to be primarily driven by men with medium and high education, whereas we find some differences for women. And for partnership status, we find in a tendency in England and Ireland that this is indeed driven by partnered individuals rather than unpartnered men or women, whereas in the US we find the opposite somewhat. We also look at the complier population. So what this means is that the causal effect that we estimate in an instrumental variables framework is not an average treatment effect, but it is rather a local average treatment effect, meaning it is only valid for those individuals whose retirement status is determined by the instrument. So by those that retire once they become eligible for a state pension. And this population might differ to some extent from the overall population. So it's important to have an understanding of who it is that is driving our estimates here. And we find that perhaps unsurprisingly that overall these state pension ages are more important predictors of retirement for lower educated men and women, for people in poor health, and interestingly, to some extent, for unpartnered men and women, at least in England and Ireland. Whereas we find the opposite for partnered men and women in the US, and perhaps this might explain some of the differences in the heterogeneity that we saw earlier. We do a couple of robustness checks, and I don't want to mention these in details. I just want to mention what we checked. So we checked the sensitivity of our results regarding the retirement definition, regarding what ages we include in the estimation, how we model the age trend, and indeed including fixed effects. And while some of these do affect the standard errors in the sense that these are more complex models, our results are overall robust to these changes in the model. So let me just very briefly wrap up because I think I'm running out of time here. So we show in this paper that retirement does lead to an increase of voluntary work provision in England, Ireland, and the US. This increase in voluntary work provision primarily occurs at the intensive margin. So we see that indeed, in line with what earlier studies reported, it seems to be that older individuals that volunteered while they were still active in the labor market intensify their engagement in voluntary work after they retired. We do find some minor differences across these countries when looking at heterogeneity across population groups and in terms of the composition of the complier population. But I think these differences should not be overstated. And I think really what dominates here really to some extent is the fact that is the consistency in the sense that we find this causal effect of retirement on voluntary work in all three countries. And this effect is indeed of similar magnitude in all three of these countries. So why is this important? So what our results essentially imply is that indeed there is a trade-off between market and non-market work among older individuals, and that perhaps one explanation what is happening here is that retirement does relax time constraints of older individuals and allows them to engage in more non-market work. And this is evidence for the substitution hypothesis. And I'm primarily talking about time constraints here because I think this is also quite in line with the changes at the intensive margin that we've seen, that people who are already in providing voluntary work intensify their engagement once they have more time on their hands. However, of course, we know that pension ages in all three of these countries are increasing because policymakers are looking to increase labor market participation at older ages to help with the sustainability of the public pension systems. So the question that essentially our results pose here is that it is possible that this might lead to less provision of voluntary work by older individuals because as they are more active in the labor market at older ages, they have less time on their hands to invest in voluntary work, and thus this decreases essentially the size of the volunteer workforce. This is, of course, a negative externality of such pension reforms, and while certainly I think from a public finance perspective, it would not be a wise decision to say that we should enable early retirement for everyone in order to increase the volunteer workforce. I think nevertheless it's important that policymakers are aware of these unintended consequences of their reforms, and that they might consider other policies that might perhaps help to offset such negative externalities. This could include options for part-time labor market participation at older ages, or partial retirement, to include to enable older individuals to do both, to work in paid employment at older ages and still provide meaningful voluntary work to the wider society. So this is all I wanted to say on this. Thank you very much for listening to me. And as I mentioned, we do have a working paper on this out there. So if there are any questions that can't be answered in the next couple of minutes, please feel free to have a look, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments that you want to share with us.